This is Aquamarine, which is my favourite kind of crystal. Now, this is a variety of beryl, and there's lots of different varieties of beryl. Some you will have heard of, others perhaps not. So let's explore the different kinds of beryl. Alright, before we get going, it's probably important to point out that I'm not going to be covering every conceivable variety of beryl because there are some super obscure ones that you're probably unlikely to encounter. Throughout this video, I'm going to be covering the big six. So, let's get stuck into beryl, the mineral family behind some of the most recognizable and probably prized gemstones in the world, including my favorite, which just so happens to be aquamarine. Now, it's one of those minerals that quietly underpins entire segments of the gem trade while still being properly interesting to mineral collectors and geologists. So structurally, beryl is beryllium aluminium cyclosilicate. Now, this forms in elongated hexagonal prisms that are absolutely textbook for showing off good crystal habits and morphologies. Now, what's really cool about beryl, though, is how it behaves like a sort of blank slate. Tiny impurities sneak into the crystal structure and completely transform its color and gem identity. So depending on what trace elements are hiding inside, you get entirely different iterations of a gemstone. All technically beryl, so let's go through them one by one, starting with the most obvious, which is Goshenite. Okay, this is Goshenite or Goshenite. The correct pronunciation is probably Goshenite, however I tend to bounce back and forth between the pronunciation. It's named after Goshen, Massachusetts, which is where it was originally described, and it lacks the trace elements that give it the variability of some of the other varieties of beryl. It lacks the colour. It's the least flashy of the group, however I wouldn't recommend that you underestimate these because when you find very, very clear varieties, they can actually be extremely expensive. It can form some really incredibly sharp and high luster crystals that are brilliant when you light them correctly. Now, Goshenite has been used historically as a substitute for diamond on occasion and even eyeglass lenses, although today it's more of a collector's interest specimen than it is a commercial gem. Now, emerald, which is probably a variety that you will have heard of, is the variety of beryl that's coloured by trace amounts of chromium and sometimes vanadium, chromium and or vanadium, giving it that sort of rich green that everyone really recognises, which is largely because it's considered amongst the four precious stones, an arbitrary label which applies to diamond, ruby, emerald and sapphire. Something that's probably important to remember is the fact that emeralds are very notorious for having inclusions. In fact, this is a very, very good method for spotting synthetic ones, which are very, very common in the industry. In fact, the French even have a word for this, jardin, the French word for garden, because the inclusions often look mossy or even organic. It should probably be understood that these imperfections are completely to be expected in emeralds, and untreated high quality specimens with good colour are both rare and sometimes extraordinarily expensive. They usually form in hydrothermal veins or in contact metamorphic zones where beryllium bearing fluids react with chromium rich rocks, and it's the chromium that gives it the colour. Now we're moving on to my personal favourite, which is aquamarine, which is coloured by iron instead of chromium when contrasted against something like emerald. Now, aquamarine ranges quite enormously in some situations from pale icy blue to a deep sea blue green, depending on the amount of oxidation state of iron present inside the particular specimen. So it forms in granitic pegmatites, which are coarse-grained igneous rocks, and they tend to be far cleaner than emeralds in general, at least in terms of clarity, which makes it popular for things like faceted stones. Some of the finest specimens come out of Brazil, Pakistan, sometimes Madagascar, and for those of you wondering, yes, the name comes from the Latin aquamarina, which basically means water of the sea. This one is Morganite, which is the pink or peach variety of beryl, which is coloured by trace amounts of manganese. It's a relative newcomer in terms of market popularity, but it's gained a bit of a following as a rose-tinted alternative to traditional gemstones like pink sapphire or tourmaline, which are generally more expensive. So Morganite was named in honor of the financier J.P. Morgan, the famous banker who funded a lot of mineralogical research and collection at the turn of the 20th century. You'll find some expensive and vivid examples from places like Madagascar and Brazil, and they can form in really beautifully clean and large crystals. This one is Heliodor, which granted is slightly odd in terms of the name, but the etymology of this is rooted in gift of the sun, and it refers to the yellow or the golden colour of this specific variety of beryl. Now, the colour is again like aquamarine due to iron. However, it needs slightly different oxidation conditions than aquamarine to develop this golden colour. So Heliodor doesn't really have the same market fame as something like emerald and aquamarine, but high quality specimens are genuinely stunning, and frankly, they're often underappreciated. This final one is red beryl, which is also referred to as Bixbite. Now, this one, as far as beryls go, is a little bit of a unicorn. It's arguably the rarest variety of beryl. In fact, it's one of the rarest materials in the world in the context of minerals. Red beryl is extremely rare, and like morganite, it's colored with manganese, but it's in particular oxidation states, and it only forms under unique geological conditions, usually in topaz-bearing rhyolites in places like Utah, famously places like the Wawa Mountains. These conditions are so specific that almost all known gem quality red beryl comes from just a handful of localities. Crystals tend to be very small as well, usually just a few millimeters in size, but intensely colored. These occasionally get referred to as red emerald in the same way that morganite occasionally gets referred to as pink emerald, but it's probably important to point out that this is more of a trade designation and a marketing stretch because there is nothing about that that is mineralogically accurate. If you have any beryls in your collection, let us know in the comments.